Good afternoon and welcome to the second lecture in our School of Architecture and Planning Spring Lecture Series. Today it is my pleasure to introduce Matthew Urbanski, a landscape architect and a partner at Michael Van Valkenburg Associates, which has offices in Brooklyn, New York and Cambridge, Massachusetts. Matt has worked at MVVA for over 30 years, and during this time he has planned and designed landscapes across North America, including urban waterfronts, public parks, college campuses, and private gardens. As lead designer of Brooklyn Bridge Park in Brooklyn, New York, Maggie Daley Park in Chicago, Illinois, Penn Park in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Alumni Valley at Wellesley College in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and the Gathering Place in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Matt has helped communities, cities, and institutions create dynamic, durable, and well-loved places. Through his lectures and his publications, he encourages landscape architects to seek inspiration in the unique medium of their discipline, relating to specific elements such as plants, ecology, and topography, but also distinctive experiences such as a sense of boundlessness or a place of contemplation. I was fortunate to have Matt on a studio review when I was in graduate school at the University of Virginia, and I'm thrilled to welcome him to Morgan State University today. So with that, Matt Urbanski.
All right, thank you. Everyone hears me? Give me a thumbs up. All right. Yes, good. Okay. So, hello everyone. This Zoom stuff is great because we can do this. It's also stinks because I can't see your reaction to anything, which is always a terrible thing for a lecturer to not be able to see the reaction of the audience. But well, we'll do the best we can. So thanks for having me. When I had the opportunity presented, I thought, Brooklyn Bridge Park is such a great kind of microcosm to look at a lot of different things. And so I thought it would be a fun thing because I've been working on it for more than 20 years. And, as time went on, people would say, especially once it was getting built and people were out talking about it and stuff, I always got the question, so what's the most important thing about Brooklyn Bridge Park, and I always, eventually I just decided that the most important thing was that it was built. That it's a fact. And the reason why is because it's sort of unprecedented, but also useful as an example in a lot of different ways. It was really unprecedented in the way it was conceived of as an idea. It's unprecedented in the way it was developed as an urban plan. It was unprecedented in certainly in the kind of the large park developments of New York City, in the way it was designed as a park. And it's also cutting new ground in the way it's managed and operated as well. So, all the way from kind of an idea through to current day. It's got a lot of interesting things, a lot of daring things were done, not by us, but really by the people who set it up and then carried it through. And so that's what I mean mostly by the kind of unprecedented aspect. So anyway, onward. I got to advance my slide here. Let's try this. Okay, there we go. Oh, I should have had these nice happy people up when I was saying all that nice stuff. But this is a not extremely recent picture, but one of the funny things that some cynics said, and when we were early on in the planning, because it's a waterfront site and it's not immediately adjacent to any subway stops and things like that, one of the things people said was, no one's ever going to go to Brooklyn Bridge Park. I wish they were half right sometimes. As you can see by the number of people that are here in this picture, it's actually quite crowded sometimes. Okay. So onward. So for people who aren't familiar with the New York area, I probably should have zoomed out even further for context here, but you probably see some recognizable names here with at least Manhattan and Brooklyn. And so you can see, let's see here. We can see the East River coming down through here. I mean, the Hudson River coming through here. We're seeing the East River coming in here. We got the Statue of Liberty here. We have the Brooklyn Bridge crossing here, the Manhattan Bridge, which was made a little while later, crossing right there. So it's sort of, that will help you kind of situate, situate where we are, which is the light green a kind of waterfront edge park with great views of lower Manhattan and deep into the harbor and to the Statue of Liberty. And with its namesake bridge crossing over it. Gosh, I gotta figure out how to get this in. So when we got involved with really thinking about this, this is sort of what the site looked like. You could see it's a series of piers that are actually pile supported structures, 15,000 piles supporting it. Those things that are sticking out into the water there. And then there's what we call the uplands, or lands that were backfilled, mostly sheet pile walls and relieving platforms. Also defining it against the back edge there, that tiered structure you see is called the Brooklyn Queens Expressway, or the BQE, and that's a kind of tiered highway which was made in a really kind of cutting edge way at the time when it was made. We always love to look at the history of the site, and you could kind of see a view towards the site in the upper left here from Red Hook, which is a little south of the site on the Buttermilk Channel, as they call it. And that's from 1823. I love the picture of the people standing on this kind of public promenade at the Battery in Lower Manhattan a good 40 years before Central Park was made. So that it was an early public space. And if you look in the lower images here, you start to see a really interesting thing about Brooklyn Bridge Park site, which is that the kind of city was tearing down in from this high escarpment, a 60-foot high escarpment, and tearing down. So one view is actually from what looks like roof decks or roof gardens, looking out towards Manhattan. You know, what's sticking up are the church steeples, because those would be the tall buildings at the time. And then in the lower right, if you look, you see that there's buildings, and then there's waterfront buildings, and there's actually connections between the top and the bottom. And if you look really carefully, there are trees shown on top of the building. So I always like to say, so much for green roofs being a new idea. Here's a later slide, is a later, obviously, image. This is when they were working on the BQE, and you can see it was a stacked highway. It was done under the auspices of Robert Moses, who was sort of the overlord of many big construction projects in New York City. And he was an old parky guy, actually. He was Parks Commissioner as one of his jobs for 50 years. And the thing that was made here as part of this project is the Brooklyn Heights Promenade. And you can see this kind of balcony park in the kind of middle background there. And it's pretty much an unprecedented thing. It's a public balcony linear park over a highway. It also works as sound mitigation, and it has this incredibly huge borrowed landscape view all the way across that our park enjoys as well. If you, a little bit earlier, the very end of the shipping that was happening on the site here, this is something called, this is a form of shipping called break bulk shipping. And basically, the boats have the cranes on them and everything is loose. And it's sort of like if you've ever seen the movie On the Waterfront, the kind of very dangerous job of kind of unloading these ships and swinging packages off or swinging them on, and they would hand pack them into the hulls. And there was a lot of grafted corruption because nothing was, really secured. And it was tough work because it would be too much work and then no work for months. So if you really want to kind of get a hold of handle on that kind of what was going on there, it really drove the whole economy, the whole manufacturing economy of New York at the time, though. But watch On the Waterfront. I always found it so unnerving as a kid that I couldn't even stand it at times. But anyway, it's a great movie. So the funny thing, the irony here was what they did with this waterfront is they made these big wide piers with these sheds that were for storage on them. And what they did is they made a kind of cutting edge break bulk shipping terminal, which is crazy. It's sort of like a cutting edge steam powered car or something like that. It was sort of like they really spent a lot of money on the old technology, because in fact, in 1950s, when this was done, a guy in Texas had already invented the shipping container, and it was already starting to completely change the way waterfronts were run, and that slowly caught up, and we wound up with that kind of rundown waterfront that you saw. So I'll try, to talk about some of these like unique circumstances. And one of them was that, we were working for a lot of different groups and agencies, but our core group was very small and controlled. And so it was an interesting paradox where we worked for a division, a subsidiary of the state government, also an invention of Robert Moses, called the Empire State Development Corporation. And it was it's basically a separate corporation within the state government. It's really a state government within the state government, or a government within the government, with all the benefits and powers of the state government, but also independent. And we essentially we worked for the Brooklyn Bridge Park Development Corporation, which was part of the ESDC. And the Brooklyn Bridge Park Development Corporation consisted of two people, the president and his assistant. Now, those people changed over time, but basically the decision making was very concentrated, and that really helps move a project along. It's a really an interesting thing. What made the project become a park was like a history that goes back to the early 80s. On the right, at one point when the port started to kind of really fail as a port, a lot of the port lands in New York were consolidated under a bi-state authority called the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And it was another kind of government within a government. And they had owned a lot of revenue generating sources, and they charged landing fees at LaGuardia Airport. They controlled tunnels and things like that. So they had a lot of revenue, despite the fact that they had a lot of money losing properties like this waterfront here too. And so I think totally, in the interest of the public's, interest, they thought they should monetize this asset. In other words, develop it and get the best value out of it. And they came up with this plan that was sort of reflecting what they were thinking about in Battery Park City, and to kind of basically put housing all over, which you can see on the left here. And interestingly, a group of people that lived in Brooklyn Heights, which is this kind of old neighborhood, the oldest suburb of New York, and it's right next to it. It's right adjacent to the site, and it's up on that promenade. So it sort of had a kind of wonderful privileged position relative to the site and to the Brooklyn Heights promenade. Some people, some civic-minded citizens said, no, Port Authority, we don't want all those housing. We want a park. And they got Lee Weintraub to draw up this sketch here. And what that all resulted in was, ultimately, because we're talking about, if you know anything about the arc of park development in New York, there was none at this time. They couldn't take care of what they had. And so ultimately there was a decision made between the park people and the Brooklyn Heights Association and the Port Authority to develop a plan that would be largely a park, but it would plan on using 20% of the area to dedicate towards some kind of revenue generating use that would then be used to support the operations and maintenance of the park. So it would become officially a park, but it wouldn't be on the rolls, the cost in the maintenance rolls, and it wouldn't drain money out of other parks. Now, this is a really important thing because it allows this park ultimately to be developed in such a way that it's not always a political football being played against the other parks in terms of, the money and being divided up in terms of maintenance and things like that. I came to appreciate the wisdom of this more and more as I've worked in more and more circumstances where people want to make extraordinary parks. And if you say you want to make an extraordinary park, savvy people will understand that might mean it will drain money from other parks. So that's a very smart thing that they did is to figure out a way to pay for it independently. So we worked on an early plan with a whole team of people that was on the top that was really driven by financial planners to help, solidify that idea. And then In 2003, we won the competition, and we were very much a sub-consultant on that first plan. And then in 2003, we won this massive contract that was absolutely remarkable. It was written by one of the guys in the ESDC at the Brooklyn Bridge Park Development Corporation. And it basically said that we were to master plan a park. But we were to master plan a park within an urban plan that we were also to master plan. And within that urban plan, we were to identify revenue generating sites for revenue generating uses. And we were to identify those sites and actually identify the uses. And then we were to develop a design, and then we were to calculate the cost of the design for annual maintenance. And then we were to balance the revenue generation with the annual maintenance. And then we were to present it all back to them. And we were supposed to do that in public, which we did. But you could imagine there would be a few issues with that. So it was great, though. It was worth it. So one of the challenges that we had, and I've alluded to this a little bit, if you learn about public park making and restoring in New York City, you'll learn about the Central Park Conservancy. And the Central Park Conservancy was put together to rescue Central Park, which was in complete ruin. It was all bare dirt and broken glass and just a mess by the late 70s. And they started in 1980. By 1986, Betsy Barlow Rogers, who was running the Conservancy, had already written a book on it. But no one really understood what it meant to make a big park in New York, and nobody understood the possibility of landscape. So we did a lot of public outreach, and a lot of it was trying to talk to people about what landscape is as a program, what a park is as a program, and try to get people to understand that landscape is not partially around the pig. It's not basically, greenery, decorating things that you put in a landscape, which is what basically people thought it was, or because they were used more to commercial development and things like that. So we were kind of desperate to develop a language to talk about park making in landscapes and how different landscapes had different uses. And we came up with this type language. A landscape type is a landscape that has a use, and it might have many different manifestations. And so these are actually slides from that planning effort. A lot of these old slides are actually this is not like cool stuff to talk about Brooklyn Bridge Park years later. This is the original stuff. So we came up with this four types of landscapes because we wanted to talk about the capacity of landscape to do different things. So we had this urban type, which was, I had just been to Copenhagen. And I love this site that's on the lower right here, this kind of urban dynamic space and the wonderful Prospect Park, right at the entrance to Prospect Park at the Grand Army Plaza there. All the things that kind of happen in that kind of space. We talked about a civic landscape as being fundamentally a place that was for bringing people together in the public space. So sports courts and playgrounds and the mall at Central Park, which is this grand walkway here. And so you're seeing some of our earlier imagery that we were putting together, as well as our models, which we also used to do a lot of communication, and precedent images. One of the ones that we were desperate to try to come up with was one that we hadn't had a name for yet. And I remember flying, because we were in Boston at the time, flying down to New York and had all these slides, because we used real slides in those days. And how are we going to convey to people the idea of a kind of a boundless, a capacious space, a space that isn't about any one thing. It's about a kind of a limitless kind of capacity of landscape. How can we talk about what kind of landscape is that? Michael Van Valkenburg says over to me over the back of the chair, like I'm sitting behind him on the plane. He says, "How about boundless landscape?" I said, "Okay, cool. We'll call it the boundless landscape." So that's become one of our types that we continue to use. And then, of course, there's the natural. So we had these four types: the urban, the civic, the boundless, and the natural. This was our developing a language to talk about landscape to public. We really treated the public like they wanted to talk about this stuff on a high level. And I think that this is a good example of that. So also the site was very complicated and it needed strategies to keep it doable, and also to then explain those ideas to the public. So we developed concepts, and we came up with these kind of wonky names for them. Honestly, I mean, you got to forgive me. It was 20 years ago, and I guess I would maybe do something slightly more populist in my naming strategies nowadays. I was a little too academic at the time. So one of the things we called a key idea was urban junctions, because we were trying to explain this idea that there were moments, you saw that site, there were moments in that plan that were well connected to the city, and there were moments in that plan that were just never going to be well connected. They were cut off by the BQE and the escarpment and things like that. So we said we needed to develop these junction points. So we came up with this name, Urban Junction, and those would be these moments where things really came together. And so in the plan, you could see them kind of circled here lightly. There's 4 major urban junctions, and our programming kind of laid out in such a way that can people see my mouse moving around? Yes, good. Okay. So the programming also started to come out of the urban junction idea, where we had a great junction point here at the base of the Brooklyn Bridge, which was the kind of historic place to go down and actually catch a ferry across the East River before there was a bridge. So it's the oldest commercial building in New York City is right on that corner there. Down at Atlantic Avenue was on a major avenue that went back to the city. And then up in the what's called the Dumbo area, down under the Manhattan Bridge overpass, that's an acronym, was more kind of seamless in its connection to the city. So it suggested these moments of kind of like neighborhood park programming, a kind of thing that you'd want to go to every day that would happen at the urban junctions. And then the things that were further away, those would be things that you'd go to more of a regional park for. Furthermore, then our programming started to suggest that the piers as they march down here. So this is Pier 6. Sorry about that. Sorry. This is Pier 6 here. 5. You could see the writing on it maybe. Pier 4 was a ruin. Pier 3, Pier 2, Pier 1. And then the Dumbo area with the underneath the Brooklyn Bridge right here. But what happened with the piers is they started to be developed in a kind of a rhythm of active and passive that helped distribute those uses throughout the park. So Pier 6 is really mostly passive with a little bit of active volleyball courts. Pier 5 is really very active with 3 huge soccer fields, but it has a little picnic area attached to it. So it's, and then Pier 3 is very passive with a little bit of activity on it. Pier 2 is very, very active with basketball courts, but a little bit of passive. And then Pier 1 is passive again with a little bit of active. And so it kind of distributed that stuff throughout, but that was sort of originally generated by the urban junctions concept. So, so as we were trying to figure out what the best economic sustainability model was, we're learning about it ourselves. We have a legion of consultants working for us, at least 25 or 30 consultants at different times, from financial consultants to ecologists to engineers of all types. So we're leading this whole team, I think unprecedented for a landscape architect. And what we learned was that there were types of uses that would be compatible, which was kind of common sense. And then, like, you know, a tannery wasn't compatible, a nuclear power plant we didn't want to do. But housing, for instance, was compatible because there weren't enough people living near the park, and people living near a park is a great thing, as you can see by all the successful parks in New York. So we started to compare them all. And we saw a commercial, so there was some residential, hotel, medium, large retail. We looked at all those different things, and we found that the hotel, the residential, and some kinds of retail had the smallest footprint and the highest value. And so those were the things that we kind of zoomed in on. And then we had to explain that to the public, which we did do. So you could see what we wound up doing in the mega plan are these highlighted orange areas as we started to designate locations for revenue generating uses. And then we actually drew spatial envelope diagrams that people that would do independent developer architect packages would come and bid on these things through the Empire State Development Corporation and Brooklyn Bridge Park. But so those we kind of like defined an envelope they could work within that was totally compatible with the plan. We defined the type, we defined the height, and so they kind of fit within these orange boxes. And you could see they were also at the urban junctions. So here's a sort of how we started to kind of gives you an idea of how we started to shape the development parcel at Pier 1, which is where we had decided there would be a hotel would be great. And it turns out it was a very good idea to do that. So here it is actually in reality. So Pier 1, which is actually not a pier, but it is land. So we were made a hill on there. I'll talk to you about that a little bit more. And then you can see the hotel and condo development that was put in on this land that actually was disused buildings on the Port Authority property. You could also see, the Fulton Ferry Landing here, so this is a historic roadway down to the bridge. We could see the Brooklyn Bridge. And so this really became a key urban junction moment for us in the development of the design. Zooming in, and here is before the development was put in. One of the key things we did was we got the state to build the development build the park before the development. That was a better way to do it. And you can see some of the moments. There's a little playground at the entrance here. There was this big inviting lawn, and other things that were happening right at the entrance, including some other existing features that we then wound up highlighting, like a little old firehouse that they sold ice cream out of, and other cool things. So this little cafe was part of what was put in there right at the entrance, and had this great view of the building of the bridge and everything. Ironically, the last piece of the park being made is now the plaza that actually connects the whole park together underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. And this is the plan for that area. The areas to the left and right of the bridge were done already, and including a redevelopment of a park, a ruin here where a theater was made, a little walled garden was made here, all kinds of things all through here. But the last piece was the plaza, because they were restoring the Brooklyn Bridge for 10 years during the time that we were building the park. They started doing it as soon as we started making the park, ironically. So this is a view to kind of give you an idea of how that will be able to give us this great connection through and underneath the bridge and make this great civic space under there in the end. This is another entrance to the park. And one of the things that I love to point out to people, but only after I walk them through Pier 1, is one thing you don't see here is the Statue of Liberty. Now, it would have been possible to see the Statue of Liberty, but to the right of you is the Brooklyn Bridge, magnificent Brooklyn Bridge. Straight ahead is some of the nicest old buildings in Lower Manhattan. To us, it was sort of like, you don't need the Statue of Liberty yet. We'll give it to you later. And so what happens is you come in and you turn, you go all the way up a hill, and then the Statue of Liberty is like a kind of at the end of that view. So you turn here and you go up that Bridgeview lawn, as we call it, is facing back towards the bridge. Another of the urban junctions is down near the Manhattan Bridge. And there's some great viewing moments there at that. And the Manhattan Bridge has got its own beauty. Nothing compared to Brooklyn Bridge, in my opinion, but still a great bridge. And then all the way down at the other end of the park, at the south end, is Atlantic Avenue. And that was where we had some taller development, because we could be out of the way in terms of views and things like that. It's a very complicated story. But anyway, what we decided to put here was the biggest playground basically in New York. It was called the Pier 6 Playground, and it also was built as an initial element here. You can see the development parcels are empty. And it was the second kind of major playground that we made. We made a one called Teardrop Park, which is a very green playground also, but we don't really call this a playground, we call it a play garden. And our concept was really in reaction to everything that we didn't like about New York City parks. Playgrounds, which were very standardized and very hard and very predictable and had no nature in them at all, ironically, even though they were in parks. They sort of were defined by fences and black rubber. And so we really wanted to kind of make play within garden rooms, and you can kind of see that concept here. And that avenue going up the slide there is Atlantic Avenue. That's a major, major avenue that connects all the way back to JFK, if you airport, all the way on the other side of Brooklyn and Queens, if you took that, if you walked that way. We put other things at urban junctions like transit connections. So the harbor ferries came in at the urban junctions. That was another thing that we put in there. And this kind of gives you a sense of that kind of play within a landscape. And we also went all over the world looking for new types of play experiences and equipment that we could use. And we brought in things from Europe and from Germany mostly. And we really, we made something that was on the cover of Time Out magazine, I have to brag, and voted the best playground in New York City. So that's kind of cool. I like it when you get the populist appreciation like that. So this is just some slides to give you a sense of the feel of the play. It was very unusual at the time to do this kind of complexity, and we were able to do this complexity because we had this maintenance budget that we could work with, and we could assume that we could make a high maintenance water play area like this, and we thought it would be successful. We didn't quite realize it would be this successful, and it is a kind of when I talk to people from the Midwest and I show them this, I call this a New York level of density. Then I have to explain to people from the Midwest that people in New York aren't actually bothered being this close together. They're used to it. Anyway, so this is part of that water play area that's there. And this is part of that swing area I showed you the aerial of. So that's urban junctions and some of the things we did there. Another concept that we put out through the planning was this idea of structural economy, that we had to work with the site as it was in terms of its base structure, and that we couldn't come up with ideas that didn't work with the capacities that the site had as an artifact. That these piers had a limited capacity, but they were great opportunities for large flat expanses. The upland had much more weight-bearing capacity and was closer to utilities, so we could do mountains and long-term tree growth up on that side, you know, if you look at the two different sides of the park and cross-section. And one of the things that really grounded that was this kind of structural analysis that we did before we did any planning. We called this the stoplight plan. And the only thing that we wanted to change about the original contract is they wanted us to do this structural analysis at the end of design development phase. And I think I was the big proponent to say, no, I think we better do all of the analysis structurally of the site before we have any ideas. And that will inform my ideas instead of getting dumb ideas or getting good ideas that then turn out to be dumb because they're not as well suited to the site that we wanted to put them on. So marine divers, most of these people are actually ex-Navy SEALs. They are very specialized construction people, and they dive underwater and they analyze structures underwater. And they do seem like superhuman people when you see them. They're like all 7 feet tall. So anyway, we developed this concept here this is one of our public image slides where we're explaining that out on the piers, we could do cool things like basketball courts and soccer fields and things that are less in terms of intensity of loading. And then up towards on the land side, we could go up and we could create hills. And what we're also starting to allude to in this cross section is we could start to block the sound of the BQE, which we knew was a problem, but we weren't really, we hadn't really done all the technical work on that yet. We also did analysis of just all of the surrounding areas, and using the piers for large scale recreation was supported by the fact that there was very little large-scale recreation in the immediate area around around. All the parks were small or ornamental, or had a few things in them, but not a lot. McLaughlin Park was sort of the best in terms of that kind of stuff, but it was pretty small. So it really demonstrated a kind of need for these kind of expansive, larger scale recreation. And then we kind of did an analysis of what the different capacities were for different types of things, and started to kind of present back the data to the public and how we started to make decisions about things. And so this is sort of like the built version of the early diagram, where this is actually our Pier 2. I call it the basketball palace on Pier 2. And some upland pathways that are up in the upland area of Pier 5. Just some examples of the two types of landscape that came out of the structural economy analysis. So the soccer, we could fit 3 full-size soccer fields on Pier 5. We recycled the building's edges and used the frames to support lights around the edges, and also to keep this essence of this kind of post-industrial landscape, which people were very interested in. Picnic Peninsula is a lightweight element, much more wonderful than, massive number of picnic tables right on the waterfront for public use, and grills, so people could come there and grill. Like I showed you already, the Pier 2 structure, where we retained the roof and worked with Mary Ann Thompson to make a kind of a gigantic shade structure. And then on the uplands, we have these kind of wonderful this is like a little thing we call the Vale, where we're going up a kind of 30-foot high hill that we made, and also these kind of vegetated pathways moving up and down through the landscape. So you really get both types of things. Another concept was edge complexity. So one of the jokes in the office was sort of paraphrasing Bill Clinton. We used to say to each other, it's a waterfront park, stupid, instead of it's the economy, stupid. So the idea was, you can't be on the waterfront and not really make a lot of the landscape about being on the waterfront, because people had ideas about things that weren't really actually very waterfronty, but they just saw the park as an opportunity to make them. Like, for instance, an indoor pool was very popular as an idea, or it came up a lot. And, you can make an indoor pool anywhere in the city. You don't need to make it on the waterfront. And it was very expensive to operate, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, it was those kinds of conversations that we would have. So this concept of edge complexity, we knew we wanted to vary it. The waterfront was very, very, very consistently engineered. It had something called relieving platforms, which are basically that from above, they look like basically retaining walls, but they're an elaborate form of structuring the edge in a straight line that is pile supported. And then they have these pile supported piers. And we knew some of them were in poor condition from the stoplight plan that the marine engineers had done for us. And so we started to use those hot spots within the plan to start to guide where we could get rid of things and where we could change things to start to add variety. Or in this case, we were just trying to suggest that more length of edge suggested more of a good asset, because edges are good on a waterfront. So if you go from 2.4 miles of edge, and eventually you wind up with 3.8 miles by cutting into the edges in places and creating more edge, you're actually just increasing the asset, and you're also getting rid of things that were hard to maintain as well in this case. And we started to talk about, these are again from the planning, a variety of types of edges. Instead of, this is a relieving platform on the upper left. That's sort of what a lot of the shoreline was already. But then we talked about how we could make other types of edges that would create different kinds of transitions and connections for people and the landscape to the water. So for instance, inland of Pier 2, we actually dug out and we made something we call the Tidal Pool, which is this kind of landscape that registers the change of the tide visually, which you never can see with all the vertical edges. And it's sort of a little bit earth art inspired, but it's this big spiral of stone, and becomes a way of being able to see the kind of registration of water of the tide, which is 5 feet in New York City. We also carved back an edge of the landform of Pier 5. We got rid of the pile supported structure on the left part of the picture here. So they're demolishing that. And then we cut back the land on Pier 1, I'm sorry, not Pier 5, Pier 1. And we created a new salt marsh, kind of recreating in an engineered form, a kind of a landscape that was pictured way back in that picture from the early 1800s that I showed you from the view from Red Hook. And so this is the salt marsh after it grew in. And on the right, we decided to retain all the piles as a kind of habitat. And honestly, we used to joke that they look like 70s earth art. And it is by far the most photographed element of Brooklyn Bridge Park. And I actually have never been to the park when there isn't somebody taking a picture of the pile field, including one time when I walked through the park with 2 other people in a blizzard. And I thought I was the only person in the park with those 2, but there was also somebody taking a picture of the pile field in a blizzard. So anyway, you could get some ideas of the views that we have here as well. Another place where we cut back and made a beach was at the head of Pier 4, where we cut off the pier, which was sort of actually a land peninsula, and we carved back and made a moment for launching kayaks, which we made a very elaborate program for, that connected a series of inland waterways where we cut off the piers and created canals between the piers, and allowed people to launch kayaks off of a beach, which is sort of the best place to do it. Beyond, you can see some of the remaining port cranes that are down on the southern piers in South Brooklyn. Another one of the moments near where the salt marsh is, where people are using these ramps that we made into the water to launch kayaks at Pier 1, looking back towards Brooklyn Bridge. And this kind of gives you an idea. Now the tide is very high here, so it's coming all the way over the sandy beach in the foreground. You can also see this kind of, it's in the middle of construction of Pier 3, which was the last pier to be done. And so you can see this inland waterway that we carved through the park here. We cut all the piers, we cut Pier 2 and Pier 3 off, and actually part of Pier 5 off. And we reconnected them with bridges so you can kayak between. We basically connected 10 acres of kind of wave-free, low conflict water in terms of the shipping channel. So you could go out and you could go from this basin here to this basin here to this basin, which goes out behind us in this picture here. It's about 10 acres of open water that you can paddle around in and go under those bridges now. So that was a part of this complexity idea, and also bringing new program to the city that had not existed. The only time people were in boats were in very tame little ponds, very beautiful experiences of being in a rowboat in Central Park, basically, and things like that, but never out on wild, on the East River, for instance, which is a different kettle of fish. So other things that we did, because actually a waterfront site is very exposed. It's very exposed to wind. It's very exposed to sun. And as you also probably have picked up, we're also very exposed to the noise, the BQE. So there's a lot of trying to create comfortable microclimates within the park experience that we wanted to have drive the form making and the place making of the park. So really kind of zooming in on those things, we measured the wind on the site with wind measuring devices. The whole 3 to 5 years that we were doing this planning and design work, I was riding from my house in Brooklyn to our office at the time, which was in Manhattan, which now in downtown Brooklyn. We moved near the park, but it was up in Union Square, and I would ride my bike over the Brooklyn Bridge. And that was a great way to kind of like learn about the wind patterns on the East River and realize how crazy they were. Because there were days when I'd ride over the bridge, and on the first pile, the Brooklyn Bridge very proudly has a statue of American flag on each of the towers. In the middle of each of the tower, a giant American flag. And I could ride across the bridge and the flag on one tower would be blowing in one direction and on the other tower in the opposite direction. Not kidding. Or the flag could be straight out on one tower and just hanging limp on the other tower. Just weird, crazy wind patterns. So it was really good to learn about these things, like by riding over the site every day. And then we have the BQE, and despite the fact that the Promenade is almost sublime experience, the BQE was designed to throw its noise away from the urban development of the Brooklyn Heights. And you can see that by the kind of shell shape of the cantilevers here, that it really projected all of the noise of the traffic. The traffic jam was good because the noise level was lower, but it projects the noise of the traffic out over the future park site. And so we needed to do something about that. And we needed to basically get like a master's class in sound engineering. And so what we did is we hired acoustical engineers who actually designed concert halls. And we did some really interesting things to start to learn to figure out how to mitigate that sound. And what we ultimately did is shown here, which is a kind of not a wall. A wall would actually have made it worse in certain ways, but I'll explain how this works. But one of the things that this opportunity of making this kind of we called it the Mohawk actually, as in tongue in cheek in the office, but making this very pointed landscape at the back edge of the park is it created a couple of opportunities. One was an opportunity for kind of a wildscape on the back of it, that it was people that really wanted a wild part of Brooklyn Bridge Park that didn't have people in it. Not an easy thing to do in New York, since mostly everyone else wants to use every square inch of a park. But this wildscape on the back could be kind of like a bird sanctuary idea. And then the other thing that was neat, and we showed it in this early rendering of the beach here, with the guy in the kayak in the foreground, is it would visually lift your eye and reconnect the escarpment up to Brooklyn Heights again. And it does do this. It kind of like reconnects and kind of like it ha-ha out. It makes a giant ha-ha, and you can't see the Brooklyn Queens Expressway anymore from certain angles when you're closer into it, which is where the problem was in terms of sound. And what we learned was that basically from the sound engineers is that the high frequency sound, which is the sound that you could mitigate, travels in a line of sight. So if you can block the visual connection to a sound source, which is the tires on the pavement and the sound reflecting off the ceiling and also from the engine of the cars, you can reduce the sound. And actually, the longer you make that path is a mathematically correlated to the decibel reduction that you get. And so you could put that into a computer and it can calculate the sound reduction you get by how much of a break in the visual path you make to the sound source. And so we made these sound topography maps that where they measured the sound on the site. Then they made a 3D model, which was of course a little bit more advanced than more common now. And then we would put different things into the model and see what they did to the sound contours. But what we were trying to do is get rid of the red where we could, and basically bring the sound level that on the existing site that was out in the middle of the piers, because that seemed tolerable, and bring it into the upland area. And that's what we were able to do. We were able to get a 7 decibel sound reduction. And since decibels are logarithmic, that's actually a very significant sound reduction. So it involved a lot of high-tech geotechnical construction techniques that I don't have time to explain, but you don't normally make one-to-one slopes very easily. I'll just put it that way. And it gives very distinctive form to the park, and it really works too. It actually works a little bit better than the model predicted. Certainly in some places, it's almost eerily quiet when you get up tight against the sound mitigating landscape. This is at the head of Pier 5. You could also see in this picture a place where we cut away, just as an aside here, because I can't resist telling you, we cut away behind an existing bulkhead so that the Picnic Peninsula was on a bulkhead that was supported by steel piles and was sound. But the older waterfront, of course, the one inboard is going to be the older one because they built the waterfronts out incrementally. The older waterfront on the inside was wooden and rotting out. And so, and there were sinkholes in the landscape. So we decided to actually demolish the old landscape, but keep the newer one, and made a place where the water actually comes underneath you. The waves come underneath you, and there's a shoreline that we created behind the shoreline. So it's a really interesting solution that I think comes out of the kind of particularities. So I like to think of the archaeological artifacts that we had working here. The analogy I make is to Olmsted working in Central Park. What did he have? He had poorly drained areas, rocky outcrops that were very tough to develop, and disused areas. And he turned the poorly drained areas into the great water features of Central Park by augmenting them. He exposed the rock outcrops and made them into dramatic rock outcrops. So he kind of worked with the intrinsic geological base of what he had. He didn't like rearrange it, he worked with it. Here we couldn't rearrange it either. We needed to work with it. We worked with, but in this case, our geology in this case is our urban archaeology. And we exposed it just like he was exposing, natural elements there. So here's another view, and so one of the neat things about the sight lines and breaking the sight lines is you don't have to wall off the BQE. You just need to wall it off from certain angles. So you can still drive on the BQE and see out. And you can get way out on the piers or be in Manhattan and still see the BQE. But then you're far enough away that the sound doesn't matter. And so it turned out to be a great solution for that reason as well. And it gives us these wonderful elevated prospects where you kind of get this great view out and across. And the real lesson here came from Riverside Park, which is Olmsted's later work that he did on the upper west side of Manhattan. And what we learned there was this idea of being on a waterfront, but also elevated, really gave you a different dynamic, or having the choice to be elevated versus just always being on the water's edge or level. And so we get this kind of layering of the landscape. And again, things happen in this kind of New York density here, but we get this kind of layering of landscape in kind of layers as they move back from the waterfront edge and back and through. And then also these kind of wonderful places where you could delve into things like this. In terms of the planting concepts, one of the big problems of the site, or the challenge of the site, was it was extremely ecologically consistent. That's one way of describing a parking lot, which is essentially what it was. Parking lot is extremely ecologically consistent. This land had essentially been made into a giant parking lot by the time we got it. And we needed to come up with ways to kind of reintroduce ecological complexity. And I was just talking to somebody today about this because we're working on a book about the park, and we're talking about these types of landscapes, these planting types that we came up with, this idea of different types. And I was saying to Rachel that it's kind of interesting what the types are. I mean, they remain to be interesting, and many of them are very clear in the park now. But it's more important that there were different types. That's the more important part. The language of different landscapes with different expressions and different uses that are made manifest materially in different ways. That is an idea that gets you off the mark from something that's consistent into something that's variegated. And if those types are driven by program and they're driven by ecological microclimatic conditions that you started to make by cutting the edges of the park and making mountains and making all kinds of different peculiar shapes geomorphologically, then that's all the better. And so it's basically ecology and program that's driving the types. And then of course, plants that both you like, but also have proven to work on waterfronts. And so there's a ton of empirical evidence gathering that goes on. So we went to truly natural barrier beach landscapes that were nearby. One is a national park called Sandy Hook in New Jersey. It's just right across the harbor. And then we also looked at all the urban landscapes that do exist, both in terms of weeds and overgrown just stuff that volunteered, as well as design landscapes. And we made a whole compendium based on that empirical evidence. We became obsessed with the landscape as they developed over time, because we knew it had to look good in the beginning. And then we knew it needed to work as, you know, the craziest thing about trees is they just change size so much. I mean, architect, you know, they're all worried about inches and centimeters and whatever, you know, and meanwhile, we're like, one of our major design elements starts out like the size of a person and ends up the size of a 10-story building. I mean, it's just crazy how much they change in size. And of course, you're going to have attrition, you're going to have loss over time. And we started to think about, well, could we put a lot of trees in and have a planned attrition where we actually even design in removal or allowing trees to become fewer as they change in scale and size over time. And so that was captured in this kind of time lapse of the same piece of a hedgerow, because one of our types, our key types that we came up with was this idea of hedgerows. And we started to develop different types of hedgerows. So just to go into this for a second, one of the key ideas was this idea of, you know, lining the paths with lines of trees, sometimes open, we call that the open hedgerow, sometimes dense on the bottom, which we called the dense hedgerow, really fancy names there. And what that allowed us to do was create these shaded corridors that move through the park as soon as possible within the growth time of the tree, but then also maintain open lawn spaces, because the park land itself was not that much. We only had about 72 acres of land. Central Park is 840 acres, for instance. But the borrowed landscape was huge, bigger than anything. And so if we could make big open spaces, or relatively big open spaces that connected to the borrowed landscape of the harbor, we could, you know, connect to that sorry, trying to figure out how to advance my slide. And then by not putting trees in these lawns, we would never block the view. Also, with the use of lawns get in public spaces in New York, the lawns would have all the sun they needed to be quite healthy, and we wanted the park to be organically maintained, which it is. And if you scatter trees on lawns, you basically are creating a lot of competition for the grass in terms of light. And, you know, if there's two things New Yorkers like to do, they like to sit in the sun because they never get to do that, especially on clean grass. And they like to sit in the shade, or they might like to sit in the sun in one part of the day and shade in the same day at a different time. So those are the two most fundamental things we could deliver. And we thought we needed to deliver those two things really well. And so the hedgerows and the open lawns did that. And so we get this thing called the Harborview Lawn, where they set up an inflatable movie theater on Thursday night in the summer. And we have up to 8,000 people on this lawn watching The Big Lebowski or some, you know, movie that you can run in a park. And that's run by our Conservancy. And then, by the way, at the end of this axis of that deflatable screen is lowered, and it just goes up for the night on Thursday night, is the Statue of Liberty all the way out at the end. So you come up to the top of Pier 5, and these arms of the trees kind of embrace the Statue of Liberty on either side as you look down. So I thought it would be kind of fun to see kind of what this looked like in 2010 when we planted it. And so this is that Harborview lawn on the right. You can see some of our Doe Fund guys raking leaves here, keeping the park is one of the most bruising things for me was to quickly go online, which is kind of more novel in 2010, to find out what people thought about the park. And everyone loved the park, but they really loved the park because it was so clean. And it was well maintained, and there wasn't a cigarette butt anywhere. They didn't notice the design. I guess they noticed the design, but they didn't talk about that. They just talked about how beautifully clean it was, which was kind of a sobering thing, honestly. Here's the same shot 6 years later. That's what well-designed urban soils that you work out with pine and swallow soil engineers. So you could see our multi-stem London plane trees that we use there, and the dense hedgerow on the outboard and the open hedgerow on the inboard. Here is the dense hedgerow, the year it was planted, and 6 years later. So these slides are now 5 years old. So it's even more than this, but it's still fun to see the time lapse on that. And here it is looking back towards the, so these shaded corridors were really important due to the exposure and the microclimate. So looking back at the Brooklyn Bridge before and after. And this idea of taking away the view was very important because I called it a phenomenon in talking with the public. I didn't say it to the public because it sounds kind of snooty, but I said it to everyone at the office. I said, we're always suffering from the tyranny of the view, because the view was so obvious and so great. People just wanted to tell you that all they wanted to do was see everything all the time. And honestly, seeing everything all the time is really boring in the end, you know, and so taking away the view and then giving it back, or taking away the view of the Statue of Liberty and then giving it after you've walked 10 minutes into the park, it's really an important thing. So, and then I'm going to try to end up here with a section, two short sections on, this was a reuse of materials in the park. We had a whole rainwater collection program that we were collecting and storing rainwater to reuse as irrigation water with these underground pipe galleries that we were putting in. And then used water gardens as a kind of expression of our stormwater recycling and filtering system. Really, to me, they were just a great excuse to make wonderful water gardens, but they also did have an infrastructural use. And so this is actually quite early pictures of those water gardens. We also, through our connections through the Parks Department and other city agencies, found that there were big demolition projects going on through the city, and we were able to get materials and have them be incorporated into the design. And I remember I got a call from Joshua Laird, who was the head of the planning department, the planning division of the New York City Parks Department, and he had connection in the DOT, and he said that, you know, they're taking down the Roosevelt Island Bridge and it's covered with this granite veneer, and they need to get rid of it. What do you think? I said, send it to the site. He said, what are you going to do with it? I said, I don't have any idea, but send it to the site. We'll figure it out. And we wound up milling the leading edge of it and actually creating this kind of giant civic staircase that's sort of a performance space. We call it the Granite Prospect. My little conceit was that people were going to think it was some ancient stair that we built the park around. And 12 years after the park was done, I was giving a tour to a group from Texas, and a lady in the park said, it's so neat that there was this neat old stair here that you worked around. So a little trick worked. And this is it. It gives this great view out towards the Statue of Liberty in Lower Manhattan, and then you can kind of, it actually is called a place of public assembly according to the New York City Building Code. And I could explain more about that. But anyway, and then just finally, Pier 3, just is sort of one of the last pieces that we made, which was the kind of the furthest from either end of the entrances from Atlantic Avenue and Fulton Ferry Landing. And we kind of had learned a lot about lightweight landscape construction through various projects, including Maggie Daley Park in Chicago, which is all on structure. And we decided to bring a little bit more of a robust green landscape onto this pier using kind of lightweight techniques, and to bring some of the last things that people were looking for in the park. So a big kind of informal lawn that wasn't for playing soccer on, but was that had a lot of little coves for lots of great prospect and refuge all around the edges. A big hard paved space that they could do art installations and programming and fundraisers and stuff like that on the corner. A more complex garden that had lots of picnic tables in it. And then running all along the left side of the picture here is this kind of next stage play garden, where we call it the Discovery Garden. It doesn't really have any play equipment proper in it, but it just has a fun lots of fun objects. Some of them are found and some of them are designed to be engaging landscape elements. So this is just a kind of some views of Pier 3, which was pretty much an instant landscape when we made it. We used these boat mooring cleats to kind of make this kind of surreal landscape of very informally, of course kids play on them, but it's not a play equipment. But kids love to do that. And you see dad trying not to be helicopter dad there. He's really trying very hard, but he's not controlling himself well enough, in my opinion. Anyway, we put in some really fun things like sound devices, and there's this mirror maze made out of polished stainless steel, all integrated into the landscape. And so with that, this is a view from the Granite Prospect and the before and the phasing of the project. The project was phased, and there was great benefit actually to phasing it because we got to have another ribbon cutting every couple of years, which is always fun for the politicians who come and take credit for everything. And after. So with that, I could take questions if I left any time for them.
We didn't have a specific end time, so I think you're good. I'm going to go ahead and give everybody the permission to unmute themselves.
Great.
And then I think, Sarah, did you want to moderate the questions? Or would you like me?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, everybody is able to unmute themselves to ask questions if they want. We're not a huge group this time, so.
Okay.
I guess I'll start because I'm a big fan of the park, and I watched its development over the last 2 decades. And I went to some of the original. I was involved in some of the original planning meetings when I worked for the city in the late 1990s. So I remember the evolution of the idea a little bit. I thought it was a great presentation. You really captured the essence of what you designed and shared that with the students. So I appreciate that. I am wondering what your perspective is on the reconstruction of the Brooklyn Queens Expressway, which is the latest in a very long line of hot button issues that you did a good job of kind of navigating around, because New Yorkers, the other quality besides liking sun and shade and being close together is New Yorkers are vociferous and they will let you know how they feel about everything. And the latest being the Brooklyn Queens Expressway, which now has reached its at the end of its or nearing the end of its design life, and it needs to be reconstructed. So there's been many different plans and variations of those plans floated, including a kind of total reconstruction and the loss of the promenade for some very long period of time, and then a kind of rebuild. And then there's alternatives about using the edges of the park, and people have brought up why wasn't this planned into the planning of the park, that this highway would need to be reconstructed. And I thought maybe I could give you the idea to comment on that and say what you think should be done.
Okay, yeah. Well, it was planned in. One of the things that we did was you can see actually there's quite a bit of space behind the berm and the Brooklyn Queens Expressway. One of the things that we wanted to have was some parking, because we knew that there were people coming from parts of New York City, especially southern Brooklyn, that really could drive. They have, almost regular suburban houses and have drive cars, and many people drive to work, in New York, mostly, working class people. The elites all take the subways. At least the short subway rides, and then the really long subway rides, the working people are also on those too. But anyway, so we put parking back there, and so we created a kind of neutral zone that, because there was no plan, but we kind of imagined that you might need to build a BQE or a temporary BQE next to the BQE while you're rebuilding the BQE. So we kind of left some room to work there, as much as we thought we could sacrifice a precious parkland. So that part was done. There's other tight spots that have to do with existing buildings that we, couldn't do anything about. In terms of the plans, we joined a team with Big to kind of come up with a kind of, well, if you could, it would be better to put the piece of the BQE here into basically essentially like an above ground tunnel, and then cover it with landscape and make a connection from the promenade down to the park, and sort of like extend the kind of tiering of the landscape that our sound wall created, and just keep tiering up, and take it, and we could add, I can't remember what we calculated, but I think it's something like 10 acres. Well, it's some number of, I shouldn't say because I can't remember it. Sometimes I remember those numbers exactly right, and sometimes not. But you add a good number of acres to the park with that idea. And it was not what people, engineers had been thinking about. They had come up with some, they almost seem like red herring ideas, like put the highway on the promenade. Oh yeah, people really love that idea. Put the highway on the promenade for 10 years and rebuild the BQE. It's like, ooh. Anyway, we got our idea into the evaluation matrix, and I don't know what the exact current status of that is, but we have been trying to come up with the next generation BQE there. They call it the BQP. That's Bjarke Ingels being cheeky.
I have a question. You mentioned at the beginning kind of the maintenance of the park, and then talking about the hedgerows and showing that wonderful graphic of trees, as you said, start off kind of at our height and then get 30 feet tall and get winnowed out. What do you have a maintenance plan that you put together that really shows how the park will grow over time and how it will be maintained over time?
Yeah. So we had to put together essentially what was like a manpower plan first, right? Just in order to kind of come up with the budgets, and that's strongly connected to the types of and levels of maintenance that we saw for the different landscape types as we were recreating them. And we worked with there was a specialist at Signe Nielsen. Signe Nielsen's a landscape architect in New York for a long time. And she had in her office a guy who was sort of a specialist in that sub specialty. By the way, a good one for somebody to go into. And his nickname was Tree Bob. And he helped us compile all of those hours of labor that needed to go in order to come up with a budget. So that was it on a kind of macro financial planning scale. Then the one thing that we didn't have like a head of horticulture while we were doing the plan, and we wanted to have one, but the Brooklyn Bridge Park Development Corporation was very lean and mean at the time. Subsequently to that, like when in our Gathering Place Park, we talked the client into getting the head of horticulture and the head of operations on board a few years before the park was done being designed. And so what we did is we had extensive meetings with the Parks Department to vet our ideas, and City Parks Department, State Parks Department, and also the Battery Park City Parks Department, which is a kind of a specialty Battery Park City Park Conservancy, a kind of a more specialized parks department in Battery Park City that was sort of the cutting edge of everything in New York City. So we talked to all of them about all of our ideas, and they informed everything that we did. That being said, when you finally hire a head of horticulture, they're going to have their own opinions and things like that. So what we've done is we've really tried to collaborate, and we volunteer a lot of time. We also get hired by the park to do work to kind of help progress the development of the landscape, because it's a living thing. And if you make a landscape in an open site, you basically have a very sunny exposed site, and the plants that grow in that over time, those are the old field plants and the barrier beach plants and things like that. Over time, you can start to create enclosed woodlands and shadier areas and things that are quieter, and you could start to put in like rhododendrons and things like that that you would never put in on the first pass. And that's what we've been able to do. Or that's what Rebecca McMacken, who's the head of horticulture, has been able to do, sort of in collaboration with us. And so the park is kind of always evolving, and we always try to promote that as an idea with any new client that we have on parks. That's one of, I think, the really important lessons in the park.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's just you've created all these different microclimates, which are just pretty fascinating to see within, particularly on an edge condition of Brooklyn. So it's wonderful.
And evolving. I mean, they're just not static. You know, nature is not static, and
Right.
it's just they're constantly evolving.
Any other questions? We're 5:17.
I had a quick related question. Really wonderful presentation, Matthew. It's about having several parks designed at various stages of design and construction simultaneously, how you could actually learn from one and implement it in another. So what was a lesson that you learned the hard way on this project?
So there was two things that I'm bitter about.
Yeah.
I did not have anything, but now I kind of, you know, the longer it's done, the more it's not your park anymore, and the more, no, you know, people can do what they want with it. That's really hard, by the way, to get used to that idea. I know what my children are only 9 and 13, but it's going to be the same kind of thing. You know, eventually they're just going to have to go off and do their own thing. And you know, one of the things that I love that they just never could figure out how to do well, and it had a lot to do with always doing the construction in the wrong season and things like that, is we made these, the construction of the hard surfaces was very inexpensive in Brooklyn Bridge Park because it had to be so vast. And we also didn't want to use fancy materials and make it into this kind of bourgeois place that so many of the other parks that were being made were like, you know, with lots of granite and stainless steel and things like that. And so we used asphalt with a stone coating rolled into the top. It's called chip and seal as a process. We had seen it used on a waterfront over in Bayonne, New Jersey, which is just across the way. And it was this light colored limestone. And what we loved is it actually was a little friable. Like it had this kind of rural feel to it. It was light colored, so it reflected the light. It felt more like the beach and more like a bright sunny waterfront, because New York City is very dominated by blacktop in terms of the parks. They love blacktop because it's cheap. And unfortunately, the kind of maintenance neatniks didn't like that the gravel would come off, and then you know, people complained about, you know, roller skating on it, and so so they decided not to do it anymore. And so there's only a little bit of it left in the park because some of the park, you know, they have to continually maintain things. So that was one thing that I was sad about. I really thought it was a unique thing that got to this kind of interesting, I didn't really talk a lot about this kind of scalelessness and this kind of rural quality, kind of post-industrial, post-rural quality that we're going for that was very, very different than any other New York City park. I really thought that that material did that. So that was one thing, you know, it's sort of like artistic desire clashing with maintenance and kind of expectations of normalcy too. And the other thing was we were very pressured to incorporate a mixed-use bike lane into the park. We actually didn't want to. We wanted people to bring their bikes into the park and bike to destinations within the park, but we wanted people to actually, we wanted to put bike lanes on the road behind the park, and if you needed to ride through, just go back there, because we knew that the prediction that no one will ever come to Brooklyn Bridge Park was not going to be true. And so what we did is we came up with a mixed-use lane that was basically a 30-foot wide section. And it was very lightly delineated with a line of cobbles down the middle. And I've not been really involved in all of the details of how that's being redone, but it's basically being redone through the whole park. They're putting a much more, in my opinion, prosaic bike lane in that half of the lane. You know, with all of the standard designations. We came up with all our own unique designations. We used cobbles to create rumble strips. We used little barriers at moments where people walked into the pathway so the bikes would, and the people would know that bikes were coming. It was a little too what's happened with urban biking is it's become very rule bound. Fortunately, they're learning that some of their earlier rules were really stupid and made a lot of very dangerous things, including, well, I won't go into that. But anyway, so, it's another case of, I think, expectations of normalcy sort of winning out in the end.
Thank you.
But
Anyone else?
also we were able to add things to the park as we developed it. The play area at Pier 6 was so wildly successful, and the little tiny one at Pier 1, that we decided we needed more. And so Pier 3, which got the Discovery Garden on it that I showed at the end, and also there's another water play area that we built on the upland of 2 that I didn't even get to show you. So we added more play in response to how the park was used. And there's a lot of little things like that that happened throughout. And then there's tons of adjustment of the way they operate the park that they've done over time as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. How I think, I'd like to invite you back just to talk about the materials of the park, because what you were touching upon, what your aspirations were and how they were in not necessarily opposition, but they were and not contrary, but they were different from the other kinds of parks that were in the city, and that there was something distinctive here that was a little less precious,
Well, I could explain it this way. Basically, we felt like there was a kind of post-industrial sublime to nature, to the site, both materially and in terms of the scale.
Yeah.
We call it a scalelessness. So like a very important thing, you notice if you look at the piers, there are no lights around the perimeter of the piers. Like your standard waterfront, bourgeois, Paris waterfront, you put cast iron lights along the edge of the pier and it looks like a civic waterfront. Well, to us, those were basically loading docks along the outside of the piers. It's 30-foot wide, beautiful. We just made a nice, simple railing that went along there. But we thought if you had lights modulating that space, and by the way, you would look up into them and you'd never be able to see the night sky again because the lights would be in your eyes. We said, we're going to put the lights behind the viewer, and they're built into those frames. And they're built into the frame. So they're absolutely, no one knows there's lights until the lights go on. So there's a lot of material decisions that come out of the kind of the scalelessness that we were we thought it was a resource that you could easily squander on the road to good intentions, like by adding human scale and civilizing and, bringing rich materials and all these different things that are sort of standard tropes that would have just made it like a lot of other parks.
Thank you. Real good.
Colleen, you're on mute.
Sorry. I was saying, sorry to jump in. We probably have time for one more question, but we do have to finish up at 5:30 because we have some classes starting. So does anybody have one more question?
No students? Come on, guys.
All right. Well, thank you for having
Thank
me.
you, Matt. This was
Thank you
really
again.
amazing. I can't. I loved the scale of the project. It's like 6 different projects in one. And I just thank you so much for taking the time to come and speak to the faculty and the students here. And I know we had some coming from outside school, which was great. So thank you, and we'll definitely be in touch.
Thank you. Good luck, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.